As always, check the video title, video description for any updates I might have to post after this video is made. And also follow the blog at customtype1.com for loop follow updates. So I'm going to show you the last three rows of alerts. These will, like you've seen in the last video, the general alerts video, these don't even display if you only have Dexcom entered because you can't use them without the extra Night Scout and loop data. So I'm going to show you not looping first, and I'm not going to cover any of the general purpose info that was covered in the last alert video. I'm just going to show you what's specific to these. So not looping, this is exactly what it sounds like, is anytime you have a red loop, for how long until this alert would happen. And then we also have the ability to use BG limits on it. So for instance, if you're within a specific range, I don't need to alert. So I only want to alert if below 100 or above 160, for instance. Otherwise, if you're not looping and you're on a flat line, there's no need to, for instance, be woken up at night. And again, don't forget, if you want to use the specific alert, you need to make sure it's active for every alert that you want to use. Miss Bolus is a really cool one. With kids, you know, a lot of times they not only forget to pre-bolus, they forget to bolus entirely. So here's how this alert works. I'm going to step through it. The first option you have is time, is saying, what's the carb time? So if the carb time is now, how much in the future until we trigger this alert? So 10 minutes, anything 10 minutes after the time of carb entry is what this means. And then from that point is, what's our pre-bolus time? We want to allow for, if our kid did remember to pre-bolus, how much look back period before those carbs do we want to take into account as a bolus for those carbs? So in this instance, any dose within 20 minutes prior to a carb entry can be assumed to be a pre-bolus for those carbs. But with AB branch specifically, where you might be having a lot of little boluses, we also need to tell it what boluses do we want to ignore as a pre-bolus, because we can't look at a bolus and a carb and know, well, was that bolus for those carbs? Because some people might have a 2-carb entry and a half a unit, and that was exactly what they needed. Others could have a 20-carb entry and half a unit, and that's exactly what they needed for the bolus. For us, most of the auto boluses are 0.2 or less. So for instance, if we set this to 0.3, I can assume anything under that was an auto bolus. Anything over that was a specific manual dose. So you set that where you need to, and I typically say, look at what your normal doses are. Is a normal snack a 2-unit dose and up? Maybe you set this to anything over 1 unit. So anything 1 unit or less, it's going to ignore. Now, the same thing with carb grams. We don't necessarily want to trigger this if you enter low treatment carbs. So what are some small carb entries that you just don't want to bother with this miss bolus? Because even a 10 unit or 10 grams of carbs might only raise your BG from 80 to 120, so we don't need to worry about that. So what point do you want to ignore? That's what you enter for this. And then lastly is, do you want to ignore it under a specific BG? So for instance, if you're entering, maybe you're really low and you're entering 20 carbs for low treatment. Well, if you're 50, you aren't going to necessarily want to bolus for that. So let's ignore the missed bolus alert for those as well. So that's how the missed bolus alert works. The next two are both similar. They're sensor age and cannula age. So it's your Dexcom and your pump. In Night Scout, these run off of CGM sensor start and pump site change for the cannula age. So when you're using these, when you change your Dexcom sensor, As soon as you click sensor session start in the Dexcom app, go into Night Scout and just create an entry. You don't have to type anything in. Create an entry with the option type of CGM sensor start. For changing out your pump cannula or your Omnipod, create an entry called pump site change. And this will trigger based on the 10-day Dexcom and the 3-day cannula or pod change. And this one is based on hours, not minutes, like most of the others. So this says sensor age, alert me 8 hours before I have to change my Dexcom sensor. I actually have this all the way up at 24 hours. I like to know the day ahead of time. Um, a day ahead of time, sorry, while I set those, a full day ahead of time, and then 12 hours ahead of time so that we can plan out if we're going to be going out to eat, maybe we need to change it earlier or later. And the same thing with cannula, age, pump site change, how many hours ahead of time, and how long do you want to snooze it in number of hours. Override start and end. These are rather simple. You just turn it on. There's no other settings other than your sound settings and your snooze settings. If an override gets started or if an override ends, this will trigger the alert. These are handy because like, if you're like us, you find your child accidentally clicks that pre-meal button at the bottom of loop, or your child, is dropping slowly and at 90 and gets worried and puts a low override on that you think is going to cause an issue. You'll get notified when anybody starts an override, whether it be directly from loop or a remote override. When it gets started or ended, it will trigger these two alerts. Pump is your insulin units remaining in the pump. So if you are if you need, for instance, you need 8 units overnight to make it from bedtime until the morning, um, set that at 8 units and it will alert you at, for instance, 10 p.m. If you hit 8 units, you're going to need to change your pump before morning. IOB and COB are brand new. These actually came, I added these from Loop's 2.2.5 bug or whatever it was, where Loop was miscounting the IOB. Actually, more accurately, Loop was not counting IOB in certain instances, and it was auto-dosing as if it hadn't just auto-dosed. Now, this has a lot of options embedded inside these 4 main settings here. So I'm going to kind of explain them. The first 3 go together, and then you have this secondary total IOB option below it. The first 3 simply say, I want to be notified if there are this many boluses of this much insulin within this much time. So, for instance, 20 minutes, we'll say 1 unit. If there are 3 boluses of 1 unit or more within 20 minutes, this alert will fire. And that solves any safety issues you may have had of that loop IOB bug. Because if it's auto bolusing a lot for carbs because you didn't enter a bolus, so it's doing it automatically but not counting it, this can trigger it. Now the second half is total IOB, and I know this isn't all exactly necessarily IOB exactly as defined, but it made it simpler for the concept of this alert. Total IOB will count it in 2 ways. One, it will use Loop's reported IOB, which usually should be your total IOB. But because Loop doesn't always, because of that bug where Loop didn't actually report the correct IOB, this will also sum up the total of everything it counted in the 3 options above. So as an example, let's say you have a total IOB of 9, and your boluses is set to 3, or so 3 units or more of 3 boluses within 30 minutes. Well, the sum of that would be 9. So those, in theory, should both trigger. But what if you had 4 2.8 boluses? Well, they wouldn't trigger the first section, but they would trigger the second section. So it's just a little extra safety factor in this alert. And then this snoozes by hours, similar to the sensor and pump change, because your IOB is decaying over 6 hours. So it's not something that you need to alert to every 5 minutes. It's more the safety factor of, whoa, here's the alert. Do we need to address something that's going on with loop, or my child accidentally dosed too much? Things like that. And then carbs on board is similar, but much simpler. It's a simple alert. Notify me if carbs exceed X. So, for instance, it's not uncommon for my daughter to have a 50, 60 carb snack, but it would be uncommon for her to have 100 carbs on board all at once. Usually the only time that happens is when we're going out for tacos and having a soda with it. So I want to be alerted anytime carbs hits 100. And the reason for that is, if that didn't trigger the IOB alert, which it would have for us, that means she didn't dose for it. Well, it might trigger the missed bolus alert, but that would come later. So if it's a legitimate carb entry, um, I want to be notified, because I want to maybe watch what she's dosing for it, or make sure she doses for it. If it's an accidental carb entry, I really want to be noted for it, or notified, because I don't want an accidental bolus going in following that carb entry that wasn't correct. And again, this is snoozed for hours only. So that's alerts. We're going to have some other videos. Check them out for some of the other settings.